My last video was ended rather abruptly. I don't know what happened. In event, we were discussing freedom, the history of freedom, and the two traditions of freedom in the West. One of which is, you might say, is freedom, so-called, because it's a tradition that leads to tyranny. The word in India, a Sanskrit word, according to Dennis Dalton, Swaraj, S-W-A-R-A-J, Swaraj, contains in it two ideas of freedom, one being internal freedom, and the other being freedom from the imposition, a restraint on your actions socially or politically, somebody stopping you from doing what you want. So in the history of freedom, there are those two senses of freedom, an internal freedom and an external freedom. And in the history of the West, the Anglo-American tradition, they're really combined. They're combined in the same idea, really, the idea which became flesh. The first chapter of John starts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I may be misquoting it, but the idea is that it introduces a Greek concept of logos, meaning concept and idea, and a concept and idea that in Greek thought, in Plato's thought, was an intermediary between God and man. It represented a medium stage, an intermediary between God and a cosmic rule and law and man. And John makes very clear in the opening of his gospel that this idea has become flesh and dwelt among us. The idea logos also in the Hebrew carries the idea of revelation. So this idea has become, this word, this idea, this concept has become flesh and has become our revelation. Now, this is really, really important when you consider the history of freedom. Many people want to ignore, deny the Christian influence on the founding of this nation and on its fundamental concepts of human rights, of human freedoms. And those who deny this, of course, are wrong. They're correct, however, when they want to point out the secular influences on our founding, and they were there as well. The Enlightenment, you can see the Enlightenment and the Reformation as the two primary foundations of American freedom and of the American mind. And the Enlightenment, and it's, even though secular, it still borrowed its ideas of value, of morality, its understanding of human rights and law. That was still borrowed from Christianity. And then, of course, the Reformation itself, through the Puritans, Calvinism through Puritan, was a tremendous, tremendous influence on the American founding, the Great Awakening. We need to look at the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening. We need to know who Witherspoon was, and Whitefield, and Edwards, Jonathan Edwards. These men, and I did not know this until a few years ago, they were not only biblical scholars and preachers, but they wrote all manner of philosophical treatises on the problems raised by the scientific revolution and raised by the Enlightenment. And those are some of the technicalities we'll get into as we go, the relationship of mind to nature. And they're very important because they work out in detail the kind of intellectual machinery in the history of ideas that embody all of our institutions, all of our thought, all of our culture. And so they're the kind of the machinery in the same way that the Constitution was the machinery that put into place the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. Still, the Constitution, I believe, contained a certain Christian expression. I mean, it's still contained within its structure and the ideas behind it. It was a capstone really to the Declaration, but I can understand the argument that it's a neutral document for implementing the Declaration, but it nonetheless does have some Christian ideas in the background, if not the foreground, and it certainly was there to put into practice the Declaration. So, again, we'll be looking at two traditions, those of liberty and tyranny, the Anglo-American tradition, which leads to the kind of liberty we understand, political liberty, and the continental tradition, really the influence of the German philosophers, and Rousseau, the French Revolution, which was so dramatically different from the American Revolution. Why? Why was that so? There were different ideas behind each, different traditions in liberty, one in fact leading to liberty, and one to tyranny. That's what we'll be exploring. And I thank you for joining us today with all the crooked furrows and the twisted turns and imperfections. Much like the path to political liberty, it has been a path strewn with false starts, barriers, imperfections. It's not a perfect world, and we have not entirely lived out the meaning of our creed, but we're working on it, and this has been the best experiment in that effort in the history of man.